Welcome to the Library of Humanity. Today we're looking at the historical context of today in the modern age and how white culture and male culture has been dominant and why that is, and how we can study other cultures in history and that are still alive today in order to understand a new perspective. So first I'm going to be referring to spiral dynamics a little bit. So if you don't know spiral dynamics, I'm going to refer to that, and specifically stage green, which is basically postmodernism. So postmodernism is the belief that we can understand all perspectives and that all perspectives are very, very important in order to know more about truth. Whereas the modern age had a very influential view from the European perspective. So European modernization, such as capitalism and science, has dominated the world since about 1750, 1800. And that reminds me of why I have a little bit of authority in talking about these ideas. Is I'm studying to be a social studies teacher, but also I was a philosophy major and political science major in college. So it gives me a little bit of credentials, but also I'm just interested in these topics. So I think the interest and the motivation to study and think about these things is more than enough to talk about these topics. So first, we need to think about some of the earliest civilizations and which of those earliest civilizations still have an influence on today's culture. Because the Greeks and the Romans, they were the influence of the Europeans. They were the root of the influence. So if you want to know a little bit about European culture, you got to look at Romans and Greeks, Greco-Roman history. And if you read that history, it's also about Christianity. So the Greeks and the Romans were the first civilization in Europe, and then that kind of transitioned to Christianity. And so those are the two main influences on European history until modern science came about. So then modern science in around 1700, 1750, that was the third huge influence on Western civilization. So I'm going to call European and Western civilization are basically the same thing, because when America and Latin America, Canada, Australia, these are civilizations that were very influenced by Europe. So then that became the West with a capital W. So Western civilization is highly, highly influenced by the history of Europe. And the history of Europe and the belief system of Europe has spread across the globe. So today we have globalization. And globalization is actually all countries adopting European belief systems, such as capitalism and modern science. So some people who are a little bit more stage green or postmodernism, people who are very Democrat. If you're in the United States, you might be liberal, very liberal. And so we might be very interested in what are some other belief systems that we can study that have equal value, right? So like maybe we should study the history of Africa, the history of Latin America, the history of Asia. What about the philosophy of China, the philosophy of India, the philosophy of Aboriginals in Australia? So these are all influential civilizations that we could study that would be an alternative to European, which is white and male dominated, which is dominating the world today. If we want a fresh perspective, right? We want all perspectives if we are postmodern type thinkers. So that's why I think we need to focus on other civilizations, other histories, instead of the kind of European centralized or Eurocentric. So that's the word, European centric. So the European centric view on history. Because if you read a lot of textbooks from maybe the 70s, 80s, and 90s, those are all European centered. Those are all based on white America and white Europe from that perspective. To understand other perspectives, we might want to read historians that are from Latin America, from Africa, from China, or from the Middle East, because that gives us, again, a fresh perspective, and that widens our view of truth. Because when you're at just looking at from the European perspective, just modern science and just capitalism, you're looking at truth at like this. Whereas if you start studying like Latin America, Africa, China, India, Australia, and now you have studied all of the civilizations, right? So then your perspective on truth just gets bigger and bigger. So I've been studying this book for my social studies test, the Atlas of World History, and this is still a book that is very European-centered. However, it tells us what are some of the other civilizations that we can study. And so it starts with the origins of man, which is looking at Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, and eventually the Homo sapiens, which is what we are. So in order to understand all humans, right, we got to look at Homo sapiens. So people all across the globe are all Homo sapiens, and what do all Homo sapiens have in common? Okay, then it goes into the development of culture, such as worship, art, and development of metals. Then it goes into the first settlements. So humans invented agriculture in different parts of the world, and I'm going to tell you those parts of the world in 1 second. But the advent of agriculture, the invention of agriculture, is what brought about civilization. It provided the opportunity for civilization. And with civilization, now we're able to communicate ideas and belief systems. And then we have early empires. So the first is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is in modern-day Iraq, and you have the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that converge and then go out to the sea. And the Tigris and the Euphrates were perfect for allowing agriculture to come into existence. And all of the civilizations I'm going to mention were created at rivers. Almost all of them were created at rivers, or at least near water that was very reliable. So very reliable rivers and access to reliable water. So we have Mesopotamia first, and then we have ancient Egypt. So Mesopotamia, we call that the Middle East today, and then ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt was one of the main important civilizations that gave us by studying ancient Egypt, you're able to understand, I guess, how the human brain works or the human mind works. Because maybe you look at the mythology in ancient Egypt, and you realize that like they worshipped the sun and they called it Ra, right? The god of Ra is the sun. And you would wonder, like, what is it? Why would Homo sapiens or humans, why would they worship the sun, right? It has a lot to do with geography and, I guess, earth systems and agriculture and, I guess, happiness and suffering. Because when the sun provides agriculture, and when there is plenty agriculture, you're very happy. But when there's drought and when there's not enough sun, that leads to suffering because there's drought. So the sun and the rain, those are the two really central points of human worship in the beginning. You worship aspects of nature, and there's like no differentiation between nature and spirituality. So spirituality and nature converge into one. So you worship the sun and the rain because you want the sun and the rain to provide crops for you. So even the crops, agriculture is spiritual for the earliest civilizations. So if you want to know more about so it would be an alternative to European civilization. So as a postmodern person, you want other perspectives, right? So when you're studying ancient Egypt, you're getting a fresh perspective that is equally human. Because in postmodernism, we are humanists, so you want to understand what it means to be human. So that's why you got to study other civilizations that are perhaps non-European, because we've been focusing so much on European civilization. So that's why ancient Egypt would be option number one for understanding non-European humanism. Then we have the Chinese dynasties. So the second option too is ancient China. Now, ancient China developed kind of in its own vacuum, its own without connection to other civilizations. And ancient China is one of the original dynasties or civilizations in order to understand the non-European perspective on life. Okay, so if you want, for example, Confucianism is a big aspect of China. So Confucianism is a type of philosophy that came out of the Zhou dynasty, Zhou. Option 3, now we have early America, which would be the Olmecs and the Maya. So if you want to understand option 3, you have the Olmecs and the Maya in central Mesoamerica. And that would be the most successful civilization in the Americas, and one of the first ones. And option 4, like I mentioned, was actually Mesopotamia. So I already mentioned that, but that would be option 4. You would study the Sumer, Sumer, and the Akkad, Akkad, which has the origins of writing. You have the Babylonia, which was I think in the south of Mesopotamia, and you have the Hittites, Hittites. Option 5, we have ancient India. Option 5, ancient India, which is still here today. So civilizations that are ancient but are still here today. This would include India and China. However, if you look at, for example, in ancient America, if you look at the Mayan culture, the Inca, the Aztecs, they don't have as much influence in today's globalized world. But if you want a culture that is very influential still today, that would be ancient India and ancient China. And again, ancient Egypt, not so much. They were conquered by the Muslims. So once Islam was spreading, ancient Egypt and that whole culture was no longer influential in the modern age. So ancient India is called the ancient Indus civilization. So you have the Indus River, which is I think between modern day Pakistan and India. So that river, again, all of these are development from rivers. In China, it was the Yellow River. And then in India, you have the Indus Valley civilization, which came about even before writing, say 8,000 years ago. And they created the Vedas. So with ancient India, you have what we call the Harappan religion and the decline of that society. And then you have the Aryan expansion. And then you have the Vedic civilization, finally. So in order to understand the philosophy of ancient India, the Vedas, Vedas, was the first philosophy of ancient India, which was, I guess, kind of the Bible, but it's not viewed as the Bible, but it's the root. I would call it probably the root of yoga and Hinduism, and eventually Buddhism. So Buddhism, Hinduism, and yoga, those all are rooted in the Vedas. And the philosophy of the Vedas is called the Upanishads. So I would say option 5 is actually one of the best options to understand, I guess, a non-European perspective on the world would be ancient India, which is still, of course, very, very influential today. And then option 4 was ancient China, which is Taoism and Confucianism. Now, in my opinion, Confucianism is very, very similar to like conservative America, because it's respect for your family and respect for history and patriotism. But it's an alternative if you are looking for other perspectives on life that are non-European. Okay, and then finally we have the Greeks and the Romans, which of course is not an option. However, my argument would be that they're still extremely important to study. Why? Because, like I mentioned, they're like the sixth, they're in the top 6 of the most important civilizations ever. Okay, so we have the Mesopotamia, number 1. Then we have ancient Egypt, and then we have America. Well, not America, but ancient America. And then we have India, China, and finally the Romans and the Greeks. So the Romans and the Greeks were one of the top 6 most influential civilizations, and that is the root or the origin of the European civilization. And now today, like I mentioned, European history and belief systems are what are giving us our globalized world. And a lot of our belief systems, our kind of subconscious beliefs, come from this culture. So even if you are in India today, China today, Sub-Saharan Africa, these are all influenced by European thought. So an example would be capitalism. Another example would be modern science. Another example would be Christianity. And so these 3, Christianity, capitalism, and science, are extremely influential on the globalized world. So there's actually a push in schools to study less European history and less European perspective, which I guess in the short term is very, very good, because we're looking at the other 5 perspectives, right? All of the other important civilizations that we can study to get the non-European perspective and to get the human perspective, right? Another one would be, that's not in this book, is ancient Australia, the Aboriginals. So that would be option 7. Now, they aren't even in this book, and that shows you that that this is a European-focused book, or because a lot of ancient Australia is forgotten in history. But that would be a fresh perspective, and that would give you a more human perspective, like human nature. So in order to understand human nature, you need to be an anthropologist and study like every culture that has ever existed. And even though that's impossible, what you can do is you can dabble in all of these different cultures, and it gives you a fresh perspective on ethics. What does it mean to be a good person? That might be your central question. What does it mean to be a good person? And then you understand that question from all perspectives, from all cultures. Or if you're trying to figure out what is real, so you have the scientific perspective from Europe of what is real. It's the physical world, right? It's atoms and physics and biology. That's considered real. But when you go to the Vedas in ancient India, if you study the Upanishads, the Indus Valley civilization started to see that actually consciousness alone is real. Only consciousness, the consciousness that this physical world is coming out of. The consciousness is actually what's real, and the physical world is an illusion. So that's a complete other perspective. And then in ancient China, you have Taoism. So what is real? It's the Tao, which is the balance of all nature. So instead of studying nature itself, in Taoism, you would say, well, what is this balancing act of nature, right? You have night and day, and what is this balance between night and day, right? So I guess in conclusion, I would say that right now we're at a lot of postmodernism in school, and we're studying other perspectives that are non-European. However, I think in the long term, we're going to really want to study more European perspective, because that is becoming like the global perspective, right? If you look at cultures around the world, there's actually becoming less diversity and more homogeneity. So it's actually, globalization is the spread of like one world culture. So I guess postmodernism is actually world culture. And world culture is going to be actually an infusion, I would say, of European culture and like Hinduism, Buddhism, which is the focus on consciousness. So it's the consciousness centered viewpoint, which would be, I guess, ancient India and ancient China. Specifically, Hinduism and Buddhism is going to be one perspective, which is actually being brought out by the New Age. So the New Age movement is the acceptance of these cultures, Buddhism and Hinduism. But then on the other extreme, you have the European white man's perspective, which is that like the physical universe is alone real, and that we need to study the physical universe to understand reality. Now, both are myopic, because both the physical world is real, but also consciousness is the center point of that reality. So in order to understand all of it, we need to embrace modern science and embrace the reality of consciousness, and that our subjectivity, our subjective consciousness, is actually the substrate, or like the foundation of the physical world. So we need both the physical world and the consciousness to fuse together. So we have like a fusion. And that's why I think we really need to focus on understanding modern science, where it came from, and we need to, I guess, give praise to the foundation of science and understand the history of it. But then also by understanding other cultures, specifically those who advocate for consciousness, those are gonna be the two influences on the world culture, which would be, again, the postmodernism. So we're going from modernism to postmodernism, which is a lot of like schools and social studies teachers like myself are kind of in this postmodern age where we're studying all these different cultures and figuring out like truth is relative. So you have to, in order, there's actually not one truth, there's no objective truth, it's all based on perspective. Now that's going to become the main perspective in the next 10 to 20 years. But then, as I would probably say, as climate change makes life a little bit more difficult, then we're going to be shifting into the new world culture. We have to come together as a world culture to figure out what is true and real. And that's when we're going to figure out that the physical world and consciousness need to be figured out. And that's going to be shifting us into the next stage, the post world, or you can call it stage yellow, stage turquoise, in spiral dynamics. But that would be the next stage, right? I think in 20 years we're going to start entering into, and we're going to be forgetting about the necessity to focus on one particular culture. The 7 or 6 options that I gave you, it's not actually favoring one over the other, and it's not even valuing all equally, because not all of them are equal. Because truth, I would say, is in favor of ancient India and ancient Europe, because those are, again, focused on the physical and the consciousness, and how eventually through world culture it's going to be fused together. The spiritual and the physical are going to be seen as one, and that is non-duality, that is oneness, and both are fundamental, actually. So what is fundamental? It's not just one thing, it's consciousness and the physical world together. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can comment below. If you liked the video, click the like button. That's going to be it today, and I hope you have a good day.